I presume I'm here?
That is you. We got sparkling water because we were told that's
Yeah, great. They did one of the best comedy sets I've ever seen. It was really, no holds barred, nothing off the table, which, of course, how can you be funny if there's things you can't talk about?
Yeah.
All that comedians ever do is talk about things they're not supposed to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the nature of comedy is to talk about the stuff you're not supposed to.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the darkness, that's the funny bit. Like, that's where... It's like when you're a kid at school, you're like, oh, we're not supposed to say this right now.
Yeah.
Isn't that the function? Kind of the jester was sort of the important part of the court, I thought.
Yeah,
definitely.
Undermine someone.
He was the only one that could tell the truth. That's how you know a tyrant, man. Tyrant can't stand his own jester.
Yeah, right.
And so when you see people, I think there's two marks of tyranny right now. People who hate comedians, people who hate automobiles.
Right.
Really, it's like, man, that's a line of war for me. It's like, keep your hands off my fucking car.
Yeah, right.
Prick. Yeah. Well, you think about what a car stands for. It's like radical autonomy and privacy, right?
Right.
And that's the problem too with the centralized control systems on cars now. We'll help you out with your OnStar. It's like, yeah, you'll govern where I can drive. You'll govern how fast I can drive. You'll end up bloody well reporting me if I exceed 55 and destroy the planet. No, I really don't like those centralized control systems at all. I think they're a big mistake because as soon as they're put in, it's like those centralized control systems for people's home heating. It's like, well, we'll help you save on your bill until
you're
you
looking
can't
further
use your
down
heat.
the road of where they're going with it. Like, so for example, when social media started, it was the place to upload pictures, but now it's a way to try and influence how we feel about things.
Sure. Well, it's the same with digital currency. It's like, we'll make a national digital currency, and then we'll tax everything that you purchase that we think has a carbon load. And that's, you can just bloody well be sure that the behind the scenes globalists are just rubbing their hands about that. So can you imagine what would happen if the government could track everything you bought? Jesus Christ.
It's a real...
I mean, it's their dream though, isn't it?
Yeah, well, they'll do it for our own good.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people can get away with things when that's the illusion behind the message.
That's for sure.
Yeah, I remember feeling when we did the lockdowns and that, just feeling like, because I feel like I'm not as controllable as the average guy.
You don't look like kind of lockdown guy.
No, I'm
Give
not.
it a try, see what happens.
I definitely felt like a caged animal for a bit there, and I'm actually quite a homebody, so you would have thought I would have pissed it, as we say in the UK.
Yeah.
But it was just the outrage within me, like, why are more people not pissed off, outraged about the fact that we're being told it's for our own good? And don't get me wrong, that may well have been the case. Like, I was open to...
But I don't think... There doesn't seem to be any evidence that it was helpful at all.
There was no proof of anything offered. There was no... And if you dare to raise your head up and go, yeah, I got a couple of questions about this, it's like, you want people to die, And that is how they seem to control us, whether it be with comedy, whether it be with whatever. That is always the message of, well, this is for your own good, and if you challenge it... And
then the weaponization of guilt. You bet. The radical types are so good at weaponizing guilt. People have got to get over that.
And they position themselves as like the victim, and that you are the perpetrator every time. And when we talked about comedy before, just as you were sitting down, something else sprung to mind. It was like how people are always fake outraged, you know what I mean, to try and take you down. And you've dealt with that a lot.
Yeah, quite a lot. Yeah, you might say.
The social justice warriors and whatnot. And what else is it? What is the thing that I always get annoyed by? What do they call it? It's when
virtue signaling.
Virtue signaling, stuff like that. Yeah.
We can talk about all of that today. That'd be just fine. Yeah. Well, it's the virtue signaling thing that can use a fair bit of unpacking because there's a real technical reason that occurs, and it poses a continual threat to the integrity of society at large. It's narcissists and Machiavellian psychopaths, they call that the dark triad. Those people are very, very good at sending up camouflage that makes them look like they're useful and productive.
Right.
And that's actually their strategy. You see that a lot with these guys that are like women's rights advocates and that go to the protests that where women often predominate. It's like, oh yeah, you're here on the women's side, are you? I know what sort of character you are.
What sort of character is that, though? That is a good question.
Predator.
Right.
Like a real predator. It's like, oh, I'm on your side, and maybe you'll climb into bed with me.
Yeah. It's very difficult to call that out in a sense, though, isn't it? Because I don't know.
They're the white knight in shining armor in that instance.
Right.
If you're, because you had an attack video done on you in a similar sense. So what is that? Well, why do you think people do that?
To elevate themselves falsely in the status hierarchy so that they're more attractive to women, but also so that they have a position among men that they don't deserve. Instead of earning it, they just fake it. It's all manipulation, and they call it, the people who are good at that are part of the dark triad of personality traits: Machiavellian, psychopathic, and narcissistic. And so it's a form of camouflage fakery. So it's like a guy who will dress above his stature economically. Now that's a much less toxic example of it, because that can be aspirational too, right? He's trying to look better so he can clue in. But the pickup artist types, for example, they tell their advocates to peacock, to dress above their status level. And the reason they do that is because then they can signal competence that they don't have, right? Because your style of dress is a marker of your social status. And there's, for men and for women, there's lots of different ways of doing that, because it depends on which hierarchy you want to be placed properly in. But you signal with your dress your status. And so then you can falsely signal. And you do that so that people are more impressed with you than you deserve. And so it's a cheap way to gain reputation. And there isn't anything more important to people than reputation. And so really that virtue signaling is false reputation signaling. And it's a form of deception. It's a deep form of deception. And social media enables it like mad.
Because the masses are stupid, in my opinion, a lot of the time, and they just fall for it. They don't say...
It's a funny thing. It's because it is a kind of willful blindness, and sometimes it's a kind of ignorance. But once you have a society that's basically based on trust, and our societies are basically based on trust, then people can exploit that trust, right? They can act as if they're trustworthy agents, honest agents, and gain the access and opportunities that you could gain reasonably if you were honest, but you can do it in a completely deceptive way. And I really do think the social media networks in particular have massively expanded that problem, because you as a narcissistic and predatory outsider, your voice can be magnified like mad. All this trolling behavior on social media, comment sections in particular, it's so pathological. It's like, well, you know what it's like. You guys have experienced this.
Absolutely. People
will say things in the comments section on YouTube that would absolutely 100% get them punched instantly if they ever said it to your face.
Oh yeah.
And
I mean, that's
I'm pretty good at that.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting, because if they were face to face with you,
exactly,
they wouldn't dare utter a word like that. But as soon as you put people, especially people who can't control themselves and who are resentful, as soon as you put them behind a wall in some sense, they can say whatever they want to whoever they want and get away with it.
I think I've been targeted a little bit more because of kind of how big guy, all of that
you
stuff. I think people get a bit of a thrill out of almost like
poking the beast.
Of course they do.
Yeah, like shouting at the lion through the cage a little bit, like it. And
especially,
I think that's made me more of a target, without a doubt, in the last sort of few years.
Yeah. They do the same thing to Dan Crenshaw. He's a congressman in Washington. He's a tough guy. He was in Afghanistan. He lost an eye in combat. Dan's a tough guy. He was a Navy SEAL. And the trolls come after him like mad. It's like, oh, there's a war hero. Poke, poke, poke. Yeah. It's like, poke him in person and see what the hell happens. But no, it's really
very
not
bitchy
good.
sort of way of living your life, isn't it?
It's so sad.
I guess,
I don't presume we're on, are we?
No, we are. Yeah,
we are.
So sorry. Yeah,
it's all good.
No, it's good.
If you want anything cut out, then you're more welcome to.
No, that's fine.
I mean, I kind of feel like you don't need an introduction, with all due respect, Jordan. You are probably the most viewed podcast guest in history at this point.
That's a terrifying thought.
That's quite amazing. I think well done to you. You know what I mean?
Thank you,
and you've done that on content, not on
virtue signaling.
Well, you've done it on, to me, what content is supposed to be about, which is quality and not that everyone should agree all the time, and I'm sure, I might not have agreed with everything you've said, but you're bringing opinions and important information to the table rather than just bubblegum for the people out there.
Well, we're trying real hard not to be a content mill, and I have this new deal with Daily Wire Plus, which seems to be going very well, and they're more corporate than me because I'm just me, and I have some people around me, obviously, but there's always a tendency once something gets established, and there gets to be a bit of a schedule behind it as well, and then maybe say a corporate expectation. You can easily get pulled into the content mill thought process. We have to produce something of this length for this time. It's like, it's very, very hard to avoid that. One of the things that's so nice about YouTube, because it doesn't have to be done exactly to a schedule and there's no bandwidth limitation, is you don't have to be dragged into the content mill process. I went to a lot of television interviews, much less in the last few years, but when I started to become more popular, and it was so interesting going into TV studios because I always felt like a product. And that's how the interviewers generally treated me too. Yeah. And they were often sound bites, a couple of minutes, right? You're just there to fill a gap. But that is what you were there for, because it was a maw that had to be fed constantly, especially with broadcast TV, because they had to fill all the time. And so what they filled it with, in some sense, became subordinate to the fact that it needed to be filled. And that's partly what accounted for the falseness of legacy media, because, well, it turned into a content mill. And you could see that happening with comedians too. You'd get some edgy comic, and then they'd get hired to write a sitcom. And then the sitcom would be pretty good, but then they had to produce the damn half an hour every week for like 5 years. And man, that's a lot of content. And so they tended to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. I mean, some series managed that really effectively. The Simpsons was pretty damn good for about 15 years, which is a hell of a run. And then not even too bad after that. Yeah. But it seems that it's kind of run its course recently. I've watched some recent years, and it's starting to be a parody of The Simpsons instead of The Simpsons, It's
a little bit like... Actually, he's another Canadian. Marshall McLuhan said, medium is the message. Yeah. People just get put into the medium and they just then become subject to it almost.
Yeah, well, that was really McLuhan's point, was that just when a new technology arises, don't be thinking that, first of all, that you understand the technology or that it's merely a replacement for the previous technology. I see this with legacy media companies that try to use YouTube. CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is a good example. They just can't get any traction at all on YouTube. And the reason for that is they think YouTube is just TV, except not as good. So first of all, they have contempt for their audience, right? It's like, oh, YouTube, that's for, trolls and ne'er-do-wells, misogynists and bigots and racists and people on the fringe, like Joe Rogan on the fringe, because they are foolish enough to think that someone like Rogan is on the fringe, which I think is really funny. And so when CBC started to put their content, like news clips, for example, on YouTube, they put up 10 minutes of content with 3 minutes of ads at the beginning. 3 minutes, and you couldn't skip them. And then they disable comments. It's like, you guys don't understand this medium at all. It's like you get one ad, 15 seconds long, people have to be able to skip it, and you don't get to disable comments. It's like, who do you think you are? Well, we're CBC. It's like, yeah, well, that's why you have like no viewers, because you roundly deserve it.
But we are seeing those mainstream broadcasters, even in the UK, which I feel is behind America, they're pivoting and they're learning quickly, like, okay, this is how we have to control people from this side of things. Now we have to tap into this new generation. Like, we've got sports companies ripping off our concepts, for example, that are run by billionaires. And even I think the thing that really surprised me recently was the royal family, the funeral of the Queen. I thought, no pun intended, but that whole thing was dead and buried. I thought that it was a thing that my generation would not necessarily care about, be impacted by, because they are so behind the times and they are so irrelevant to our day-to-day lives in the UK. And yet, the amount of people online who were sharing pictures of the Queen and all of that, and I was like, if I said to these people, What did she do that was so great that impacted your life in any way? Not a clue, but people just go with the flow. And that's the sort of thing that is surprising about this generation.
I think there was a buried value in the Queen that wasn't as evident a month ago, let's say, as it is now. So one of the tenets of psychoanalytic idea, let's say, both from the Freudian and the Jungian perspective, is that there's a pull towards the missing opposite. And so imagine a culture is devoid of some sense that they actually need. So, for example, our culture is pretty devoid of a sense that responsibility is the counterpart of rights. So everybody clamors about rights, but hardly anybody talks about responsibility. And that doesn't work out because the rights of someone else are everyone else's responsibility. So you can't have rights without responsibility. So if you only talk about rights, half the conversation is missing. And the Queen, she's a very interesting person because she was very discreet. She very rarely shared her opinions. And so that's definitely missing in our culture. She was very dutiful. She had celebrity thrust upon her because, well, there was no reason for her to assume when she was young that she was ever going to be queen. And because she wasn't close enough in the succession line for that to be likely. And then it happened anyways. And then she's also been there for a very long time, which is interesting in a culture that values the short term. And she also managed to keep her family together. Now, of course, the family was fractious, but, find a family that isn't fractious. Good luck with that. And then she also stood for tradition and the British tradition. And she also stood for the English-speaking people and the Commonwealth. And that's all being attacked on grounds of colonialism, et cetera, and exploitation. But there's a genuine gold core to the English enterprise, especially with regard to such things as common law and individual rights and the dignity of the human being that shouldn't be thrown out along with the criticism. And so when the Queen died, people felt a loss of something they didn't even really know was there. And that loss was the call towards these more modest and responsible virtues that she embodied.
Can I just out of interest then, because I think I understand that. I'm not a monarchist, but I understand what people believe she embodied.
Yeah.
I guess on a counterpoint to that, but respectfully, her son also did something that was quite horrific as far as I'm concerned. And she abused that power to protect him, or at least it feels like it was an abuse of that power. So
she definitely used her sway in the media to protect them, and she was very smart with the media.
What are you referring to specifically?
So Andrew, and obviously we can't put too fine a point on that because of people are quite litigious, but we know roughly what the events were that happened there, and we know that people were paid. We know that people were paid to either be quiet or not to get too deep into the story or not to go to court. And we know he's not necessarily welcome in America without the FBI waiting for him to get off the plane. With that, I guess I respect what people believe she represents, and I guess I'm quite reverent of what she represents. Yeah. But also there was a sheer abuse of power there that goes beyond what anyone else.
Well,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. Well, look. So part of what's happening on our society at the moment that's tearing it apart is constant accusations of the abuse of power. And so there's a doctrine that's come out of postmodernism, and it's kind of unholy alliance with Marxism. And the doctrine is something like all motivation can be traced to power. That's a very toxic doctrine, the doctrine that all motivation can be traced to power. So let me outline that a little bit. So a lot of people think that there's a debate about who should be allowed to speak in our society, right? So we might think about that as the free speech debate, and we might think about cancel culture as the attempt to stop certain people from exercising their right to free speech. But that is not what the debate is about. That's only the paint on the surface of a very thick wall, let's say, because the actual debate is more like this. The postmodern types, especially if they have a Marxist tilt, and they almost always do, their critique was much deeper than that. Their critique was that the idea of free speech itself is a lie. And it was a lie that was created by the powerful to justify their exploitation by pretending that they valued free expression and the dignity of individuals. And so, even though it sounds like a profound and positive proposition, the idea that people have the right to free speech, it was nothing but a mask for power. And so, when people are canceled on campus by this system of ideas, because it's really a system of ideas in some sense that cancels them, the reason they're canceled is because, so here's why you and I are talking according to this doctrine. You have a following. As a consequence of that following, you've accrued a certain amount of power. You can bring me in here as a tool, let's say, to ratchet yourself up the status hierarchy. You can act like we're sharing information in a way that might be designed to enlighten both of us and our readers or our listeners. But in reality, all you're doing is trying to elevate yourself up the status hierarchy. And if you don't know that, you're just ignorant, and if you're and blind, and you're even more dangerous than you would be if you were conscious of your true motivations. And so it's all about power. Now, that's just not true. It's not all about power. And in fact, if you try to govern your relationships based on power, your true relationships, you will fail. Mm-hmm. So imagine that your wife, let's say, you're going to just use power to interact with her. Well, try it and see what happens. Mm-hmm. She's going to be miserable, and she's going to be resentful, mm-hmm. for sure. And maybe she's got more power than you when push comes to shove. Who the hell knows? Women aren't that easy to oppress. And so they have their own bag of tricks, that's for sure. And so, but at minimum, you're going to be setting yourself up for a loveless relationship based on mutual suspicion. And then imagine you tried to use power on your kids. Well, now and then you might have to use discipline. You might have to lay out the game rules, which isn't the same as like constraining them with oppression. But if your fundamental relationship with your kids is one of dominance, you're just a tyrant. And then if you try using that on your friends, well, first of all, you won't have any friends. The best you'll ever manage is henchmen, and they'll only be around you because they think they can get something out of your power. So they're the worst kind of friend because they're not even confident enough bullies to be bullies on their own. They have to hide behind another bully and be sub-bullies, and that's a dismal outcome. And then if you use power in your business relationships, it's like no one's going to be aligned with you, and the first time you make a mistake and you show any sign of weakness, your so-called business associates that you've just dominated because you have the power, they're just going to stab you in the back and leave. So it's a preposterous theory. It doesn't even work for chimpanzees. So the best work that's been done on chimps so far is being done by Frans de Waal. He'd be a very interesting guest, by the way. He's very smart, Dutch primatologist.
If you have his number.
Yeah, I could connect you. De Waal has been studying chimpanzees for 3 decades, and he's written a series of books about the emergence of proto-morality in chimpanzees. Mm-hmm. Now, chimps have to live in a social group, and for decades, and they have, you might as well call them friendships, because that's the closest analog, and they have to maintain those friendships. And they can't maintain them by dominance because, well, then obviously it's not a friendship. They have to maintain it by mutual grooming and caretaking. And so what de Waal has shown is that the alpha chimp, so you think of the alpha chimp as the roughest, toughest chimp in the troop, he's banging on sticks and threatening everybody, and he clambers his way up the hierarchy just like the Marxists would assume, and he establishes sexual superiority and propagates his genes. And the truth of the matter is, that's better than being weak and useless and dying, but it's not nearly as good as being genuinely reciprocal. And so what de Waal has shown is that sometimes the alpha chimp male is the smallest male in the troop, so that's pretty damn interesting. Mm-hmm. But more to the point, the alpha chimp is the most reciprocal member of the entire troop. So he's keeping track of his social relations. He's grooming his friends. They're interacting constantly. Like he's maintaining social relationships like mad. And there's 2 advantages to that, apart from the fact that he attains a certain degree of a reverence, let's say, and authority, mm-hmm. and some preferential sexual access. So it's a good biological strategy. The troop is also more stable emotionally, partly because it's not ruled by a tyrant, let's say, who's always disrupting things. But the alpha, who's reciprocal, also can have a long reign. Because if you're one of those chimps that use manipulation and power to climb up the hierarchy, as soon as you show a sign of weakness, 2 of the males that you've oppressed will gang together, which chimps are very good at, and tear you into bits. And so de Waal has written very frightening accounts, very graphic accounts of these like revolutions against tyranny in chimp groups. And so the people who claim that power is the only motivation, they don't have a leg to stand on. It's just not true. And there's one more thing that goes along with that. 2 more things. One is, If you think power is the only motivation, that's your whole theory, then you're justified in using power at every step, because there's nothing but power. So why not use power? And so it's a confession more than an accusation. And second, this is sort of germane to your criticism of the Queen. When systems deteriorate, power emerges as a fundamental motivation. And so part of the reason the Marxists and the postmodernists can be so attractive in their critique is because power does corrupt. And so whenever you look at any enterprise, social enterprise, any family structure, even any relationship someone has with themselves, you can say, well, look, to some degree you're corrupted by misuse of power. And sometimes that can go way out of control, right, and be the dominant phenomenon that happens in totalitarian states. And you say, well, it's all about power. Well, it is when things get entirely corrupted. But that's a whole different proposition than everything's based on power. It's more like, well, hold it. Everything corrupt is based on power. But not everything is corrupt. And so now if you look at the monarchy, well,
right.
Then you think, okay, well, how do you separate the wheat from the chaff, right? How do you give the institution its due? You have the same problem with the British Empire, let's say, or with any expansive political enterprise. It's like, well, it's done some good. What's the good? And then it's abused its power. Well, how do we decide what's good and maintain that and value it? And how do we discern what's a misuse of power and criticize it properly and dispense with it?
You're a great
Very
podcast
difficult.
in this sense. That was my follow-up question, and you basically just answered your own question. But I guess that is. Are you acknowledging, in a sense, then, that there is an element of corruption around the Queen?
There's an element of corruption around everyone who isn't, what would you say, walking hand in hand with God in the Garden of Eden. Like,
right.
Look, there's a mythological trope that's very useful in understanding this. I presume that most of the people watching and listening have watched The Lion King. The Lion King has a very, very solid narrative structure. It's a very smart movie, like many of the Disney movies. And people criticize me because I'm so interested in Disney movies, but I'm interested in anything that many, 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 many people watch for a long time because, well, what's going on there? Why is that so attractive? And often a movie's attractive because it gets the story right and the characters right, whatever that means. Well, The Lion King was a very, very successful animated movie, one of the most successful movies of all time.
Can I just,
yes.
For those who can't remember, everything the light touches is our kingdom.
Right.
Yeah,
just
well,
to be
okay,
clear,
so what that means, I can tell you exactly what that means. That's a brilliant line. And that's also, and notice I used the word brilliant, and brilliant is associated with the idea of the light. Okay, so now, when the light touches something and you see it, then you establish a relationship with the thing that you see, because now you start to understand it. And the more lit up something is, the more you can understand it and explore it. And so when you shine a light into dark crevices, then let's say, then you start to see what's in the dark crevices. And if you go around your apartment building, let's say, and you pay attention to every nook and cranny, it starts to become yours in a very fundamental way. And so you could say, well, light is equivalent to consciousness. That's a good way of thinking about it. Now, why? Well, we're very visual creatures, human beings. Our brains are organized on vision. Most animals are organized on smell, by the way, but not us. We're organized on vision. A huge part of our cortical activity is devoted to sight. And so we think of sight as enlightenment, light. We think of it as illumination, right? When we bring something into the light, we improve it. And so we associate the day with consciousness and illumination and enlightenment. And so if you attend to something by shining a light on it, then it becomes yours. And so your kingdom is actually everything that the light of your consciousness is shone on. And all that's encapsulated in that statement. And that's why it's stuck in your imagination. Yeah, you remember he's up with his son on a mountain, right, on a cliff. And so now think about that. That means he can see a long way. And then he sees this circle of the world and the light shining on it. And he says, everything the light shines on is our kingdom. And then that also implies that, and he says that next, that outside the light, there's another kingdom. And that's the kingdom of darkness. And that's the place that hasn't been explored. And if you remember in the movie, that's where the fascists are and the hyenas. and the hyenas are predatory. And so when Simba goes out past the domain of the light, he enters the unknown, and he enters the underworld, the demonic underworld, and that's Scar. Now back to Scar. Okay, so Simba has Mustafa as his father, and Mustafa's the positive aspect of the patriarchy. And he's wise and he's tough. He's got a set face. He's no pushover. But he has an evil brother, and that's Scar. And Scar has been scarred, and that's why he's resentful, right? He's a victim. And he's a victim because his brother gets all the attention, like Cain in relationship to Abel. And he's a victim because for some reason we don't quite understand.
He's smaller.
He's smaller, but he's intellectual too, right? So he's got the Luciferian pride and intellect. And Jeremy Irons, who is that character, played that extremely well with that kind of unctuous voice that was
kind of like a snaky sound,
droning.
And also contemptuous and presumptuous and narcissistic. He did a lovely job of that. And so now you might say, well, why does the king have an evil uncle or an evil brother? Well, the answer is, this is the mythological answer, is that, well, the king always has an evil brother, always. And the reason for that is if the king is the emblem of the state, or even of the stable state of being, because you can think about it psychologically or sociologically, he always has a counterpart, and the counterpart is the proclivity of that state to be overtaken by willful blindness, so failure to shine a light on things, right? To turn your head away when you know you shouldn't, and also by this corrupt will to resentful power. And that's chronic. Now, the Marxist would say, and do in some real sense, there's nothing but Scar. There's nothing but the evil uncle. It's like, that's a hell of a worldview. I can tell you in some real sense, it's akin on the Christian front to making the statement that the true ruler of reality is the satanic spirit. It's the same idea, and that's a hell of a claim, man, to literally speaking. And so, but it is the case that almost every institution and almost every person has a touch of the evil uncle as part of their structure. You know, there's no doubt that
Prince Andrew.
Well,
it does kind of take us back there.
But everyone. So imagine that to some degree you're not as good an advocate for yourself as you might be.
I don't need to imagine that.
So you know that.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
So then imagine there's part of your character that's sort of set against you.
Yeah.
And it would be set against you because, well, you might doubt whether life has any fundamental meaning, and you might be annoyed and irritated because you've been hurt and betrayed in various ways, and your development might have been stunted because you hit obstacles and you didn't explore them enough, and so your way was barred, and so there's a part of your character that is set against you, and you have to contend with that part and hopefully overcome it or integrate it, which is a better way of thinking about it. And then that's the same for your relationship with your wife, and then that's the same for your relationship with your kids, and it just scales all the way up. And then you can say, well, look, you're corrupt. And the truth of the matter is, well, you are to some degree, but the to some degree is actually the crucial issue here. You know?
Absolutely. And I guess that's where we go back to the criticism that I guess I made of the Queen in the first place. That's part of the problem with the discourse around it, I guess, at the moment, or the conversation is, if I criticize the Queen in the time when we're mourning, the immediate reply is, not the time. But that's always the response with the Queen and with Andrew. This isn't the time, don't talk about it like this. And so there never really seems to be a time. But also at the same time, when I do have a legitimate criticism, people go, well, you're anti-monarchist then. I go, well, not necessarily. I've just got a criticism of what happens there. So we can't have a nuanced, reasonable conversation.
That's the thing. Well, people don't really like nuance that much because here's
doesn't fit on a TikTok, unfortunately.
I had a conversation with a great physicist, Roger Penrose, and Penrose has this obsession with tiling. So he designs tiles, and he's interested in the mathematics of tiling, and it's in some sense a strange interest, but he's a genius, and so whenever I see a genius and he has a strange interest, I think that's probably related to his genius in some way, because after all, he's a genius. And so I thought a lot about his obsession with tiling. Outside the building he works in at Oxford, the land outside is covered with a tile that he designed that has certain mathematical properties that I don't know enough about to describe in detail, but I was very interested psychologically in the idea of tiling. So imagine that you have a surface an uneven and rough surface that's very complicated, like an uneven and rough surface is. It's extremely highly detailed, right? And it's got undulations, and it's made out of dust, and the dust is made out of, atoms at the finest level of resolution. Well, you can go even finer than that. It's very complicated, any surface. Now, when you tile it, you simplify it, right? Because each tile, in some sense, is homogeneous. That's sort of what makes it a tile. It's one piece. So you take this thing that's extremely complex and you put a simpler representation on top of it. And so one of the things I've learned about people is that we all tile the whole cosmos. So you have a model of the entire universe. Now you think, well, how can you? Because what the hell do you know? And the answer is, you use really big tiles. So imagine what you know about Serbia. You maybe you know a lot about Serbia, but I'm going to assume you don't.
My wife's from Kosovo, so I know a fair bit. Yeah.
So but then you think you know a fair bit. It's like, well, maybe you could identify where it is located on a map. If you had a map, you probably couldn't draw the map.
I disagree with a few people about what Serbia is and isn't on a map, if I'm honest.
Okay, well, that's also a problem. But imagine, you could probably point to Serbia on a map, but then I could say, well, could you draw that map without looking at a map? Could you draw a map of Europe accurately without looking at it? Now, maybe you could, but most people certainly can't. But they could point to it. Mm-hmm. So imagine people have a representation of the whole world, but it's really, 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 really low resolution. It's sort of, you can see this if you get people to do something like, well, do you know what a helicopter is? It's like, yes. Can you draw one? Mm-hmm. So they draw it. It looks like a 3-year-old drew a helicopter. It's like it's got rotors. It's like 4 parts: rotors, ball, stick, ball. That's a helicopter. It's like, no, it's not. Especially not if it's a military helicopter. I think you have to, for a military helicopter to fly, you need 35 hours of maintenance for every hour it's in the air. And the reason for that is, well, they're rocks, like they're a solid piece of metal. They just plummet. They don't fly. And keeping those things in the air is really complicated. And you have to know the helicopter in unbelievably great detail in order to actually make it work. And so when you say you know what a helicopter is, you might say, well, what do you mean? And your answer is something like, well, I know one well enough so that if I walk by it, it doesn't explode. Mm-hmm. It's something like that. And so your representation is good enough so that in your normal course of affairs, you can use it to navigate through the world. And that's how you adjudicate your knowledge. And so if you never go to Russia, you can have a really low resolution representation of Russia, and it doesn't matter. Now, the devil's in the details, let's say. You talked about a nuanced conversation. Well, let's say you're an environmentalist. Well, that's what you say, and that's a claim to moral virtue. And you say, okay, well, what do you mean you're an environment? Well, I think we should serve the planet. It's like, well, what do you mean the planet? And, well, what do you think the big issue is? Well, it's carbon. It's like, well, is it really? What about overfishing? What about despeciation? What about soil degradation? What about the idea that if you made people richer, they would become more environmentally conscious, and so maybe the best way to clean the planet is by making the poor people rich, which, by the way, seems to be the case, and so on. And what about setting aside marine protected areas? What about how much land should we preserve on Earth so that we can grow crops optimally but still maintain the natural balance? How would you define ecodiversity? Do you know how many species are propagating compared to how many are going extinct? And the answer is, you don't know any of that. And so that also means you're not an environmentalist. It also means that I've just shone a light on your claim that you're an environmentalist, showing you that it's unbelievably shallow and just a false virtue signaling flag. And so you can't have a nuanced conversation, because what you do is you say to people, you're using a very big tile to cover an awful lot of snakes, like thousands of them or hundreds of thousands of them. And I'll just lift up the tile and show you the snakes. And some of those snakes are you and your pretension that your tile actually constitutes knowledge, which it doesn't. And so if you have a nuanced conversation and you show that you understand the details, at least to some degree, then you're a threat to the integrity of the person's worldview. So you replace that unity with a complex and anxiety-provoking multiplicity, and you also illuminate their pretension to moral virtue. And so it's no bloody wonder they don't like you, It's like, oh, you said, this is way more complex than you think. You have no entitlement to moral virtue as a consequence of your low-resolution claim.
You do that. You lift up the lid a lot, and you've got security here. I was wondering.
Good guys.
Lovely, man.
Yeah, they're really good.
I was wondering, with all of the shining of the light that you've done on certain people who hold very dear to their heart their opinions and their virtues and all that, how bad it's gotten for you at times, because you become incredibly well known, and whenever that happens, I know that they've came for you multiple times, but have you ever had any situations where you thought, I could do with some security here?
Well, we decided the security thing is an ambiguous blessing, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my security people who are tough and competent people and alert are not primarily used for security around me. They're primarily used for logistics, because my days are very packed, and they're packed in a way that requires very careful orchestration, primarily because I'm on a book tour. And there's a rule when you're on a tour, if you're doing 2 or 3 venues a week of 4,000 people, let's say, and the rule is you absolutely 100% have to be at the venue early enough beforehand to prepare so that the show goes on. And there's no room for failure on that front, because otherwise you annoy 4,000 people, and that's just not acceptable, and especially if you're doing it sequentially. So things have to be timed very carefully. And while I'm doing that in all the countries that I'm visiting, I'm also meeting with cultural and political leaders constantly. And so it's very tightly scheduled. And I can't do that without help, and competent help. And so I have a lot of people who are doing things. What do? Well, I never pay attention to transportation. I always have a car available, and sometimes multiple cars. I don't have to pay any attention to flights. I don't have to pay any attention to hotels. I don't have to pay any attention to restaurants. I don't have to worry about whether my wife is doing okay, because she has someone with her if I'm not around, and someone helping her. And the reason, and my security logistics guys handle that, and I have a secretarial team that organizes all of that as well. And so that was partly organizational, because we learned on the first tour back in 2018, my wife was handling a lot of that, and it was too much, and it was not obviously sustainable, right? It was wearing me out, and it was also wearing her out. And one rule about being worn out is, well, you're either being egotistical because you think you can do more than you can, or you're taking on too much responsibility, which is also a kind of egotism and a kind of victimization, and you're not delegating enough, which is also kind of greedy, because in my situation, I have a lot of opportunity and a lot of privilege, we could say, and I if I'm wise, I can parcel out some of that to other people, and then they have something good to do and useful and interesting, and then they can be helpful, and the whole enterprise can work better. And so now on the security front, plain and simple, my wife and I talked about this last year with my family, and my wife said, John Lennon only got shot once, which is, I mean, I'm not comparing myself to John Lennon,
but it only takes one bullet.
Well, it only takes one person who's, bent. And now, if you looked at my life online, you'd think that I was just being vilified nonstop wherever I go. And that's just not true at all. So all my interactions with people in public, with the tiniest exceptions, are extremely positive. In fact, they're overwhelmingly positive.
Of course.
And so that's amazing, and it's such an honor that that's the case. Now and then, maybe 1 in 5,000 encounters, someone is hostile. And you don't forget that when it happens, because when someone you don't know is hostile to you, you don't know where that might go. And so it happened once when I was with my son, and it happened once when I was with my wife, and once when I was alone. And none of those situations were dangerous. But that doesn't mean that you should not pay attention to them, or that they're not stressful. Because if some stranger just came up to you on the street and started harassing you, so angrily and insultingly, you have no idea who that person is, and they could be anyone. And that's bad when they could be anyone, because people can get pretty damn demented, and you can run into someone who's crazy enough to light themselves on fire just to singe you. And I know what people like that are like, because I've seen many people like that. And so we decided that we needed logistics help, and we needed more eyes just attending to everything that was going on. And my security guys are very friendly with everyone, and they're very welcoming and hospitable, and they're very oriented towards that. And then they're very adamant about getting the logistics right. And because most of them are military guys, they're also very good at that kind of, detailed strategic organization. And so that's become necessary to make this enterprise carry on in an effective way. And there's a bit of a cost to that, but it's not really avoidable. I can't really go out now anytime, anywhere that's in public and just have it be ordinary, So even if I'm in Toronto and my wife and I, in our little neighborhood, we walk, it's a little village in the middle of the city. If we just walk down to the corner store or to the local pharmacy a couple of blocks, the probability that I'll get stopped like 5 or 6 times, always positive, is 100%. And so everything turns into a show in some real sense.
I wondered what the cost was to you, though, personally, like on an emotional level, because I think you're a bit misunderstood by some people, because it feels like your goal is to help people overall. That's what always comes across from you whenever I see you get emotional and things. I think this guy's a good man, and somewhere along the lines, other people have managed to maybe distort that message, or maybe in those long, nuanced conversations you've had with people like Joe Rogan, a soundbite has been taken out and that's been thrown out there, and that's the thing that people then know you for. And I just wondered how you're coping.
Well, the consequences of that online and in the media is that I'm being chewed on a regular basis by people who are ranging in social status. The last thing was Olivia Wilde's pronouncement that the villain in her new movie was based on me. And so, which was quite, by that, we've had this happen so many times now. I mean, by we, my family, because we all kind of react to this as a unit. And we've learned how to deal with it to some degree, because for a long time when something like that happened, it wasn't obvious that it could have been a disaster, right? Because you can get taken out. And I mean, by disaster, when all this blew up around me, disaster initially would have meant I would lose my professorship, I would lose my clinical license, and a huge chunk of my ability to be viable financially. Now, I had 3 sources of income, and one of them was private because I have my own company and have had for a long time. It's pretty hard to take me out financially, but that was still the risk, and then the risk to my professional reputation.
And this is all new to you at the time, and when things are blowing up, in its first happening, as from personal experience, the first times it happens, the more, oh God, out of control it feels. Whereas when you become battle hardened, you get thick skin, obviously. Yeah,
well, and you also learn how these things work and the way they work. Now, it depends on how stupid the thing is that you did that you're being attacked for, because you might bear some culpability, right? And that's a tough thing to sort out. So one of the latest scandals, I suppose, that I've been involved in culminated in me being essentially ejected from Twitter. Now, really what happened was they didn't like one of my tweets about this actor Ellen/Elliot Page, and because I dead named her, I suppose they never really told me the reason, but I presume that's dead named, because now that's become a mortal sin because of the bloody trans activists. And anyways, they suspended my account unless I would delete the tweet, and I'm not deleting the damn tweet. And the tweet has caused a fair bit of tension among some of the people I'd been communicating with who are more on the liberal and progressive side, because they really didn't like that tweet, although I'm not. It was harsh, but I'm not sorry enough about it to delete it. So that's life, that's a boundary. But when you get attacked for that sort of thing, like being banned from Twitter, which became quite scandalous and more evidence that I'm just a reprehensible character, you have to, first of all, your conscience goes after you, right? Because if a bunch of people come after you and say you're reprehensible, generally, if that happens, it's because you're reprehensible. That's generally and if you don't respond to that in some way, well, then you're kind of psychopathic because you don't care. It's like, I do care. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm wrong just because people are upset. And that's definitely the case when society has become somewhat unstable.
Your response, I've been I guess I first came across your work when during the time when you were talking about being compelled to speak in a certain way in Canada.
Yeah, the pronoun law.
Yeah, but then I read both your books. I thought they were fantastic books. They had a profound impact on me. I found them very interesting, especially from a religious perspective. I found you very interesting. We both come from I guess we identify as atheists. Yeah. But I think it's very interesting.
That's your pronoun?
As one of them.
I think I'm agnostic.
You're agnostic. I guess agnostic. Agnostic atheist. You can never really know to that extent. But I found what you were saying very interesting. And my wife's Muslim, and we're raising our kids Muslim, so I guess there's an interesting aspect with that. But what I find difficult, I guess, to justify, I'm speaking from only my experience. I went to Goldsmiths, and you might know Goldsmiths as quite a liberal Marxist university in South London. When I went there, my experience was quite similar to the way that you describe liberal universities. Quite radical. It's an extremely radical university. They go on strike
every now and then.
On strike.
Yeah, we have universities like that.
There's always something they're striking about. I don't even know it. I never went to university, but I know that about them. They're known for it.
And that's what they specialize in.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, that's the thing. I'm actually most, other than the women who went there, but that's another story.
So it definitely is. I guess from my perspective, I saw the merits. I went to that university, and I guess I was more centrist in retrospect before I went there. I saw the merit of some of the things that the left say, and I saw some of the merits in discussing Marxism and a lot of the debates that we had at those universities in that time. It really opened up my mind in that time. Not that I was particularly smart or anything, but it really opened up my mind. And sometimes I guess the struggle that I have with speaking about you to other people, and my circles will be more liberal side, because of the aggressive relationship you now have with some of these circles, it makes it a lot more difficult for me to open up some of what you're discussing with those people. So for instance, when you say those bloody trans activists, from my perspective, that's a very broad term for some people would consider themselves low down on being a trans activist. Some people would consider themselves to be radical. Yeah. How do you see that? Because I'm interested to know.
Let's look at this tweet. Because
I can't even say it, by the way. I've just tried to say the tweet. They've almost like blanked it.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
Roughly. I mean,
I said it was in June this year, and that's Pride Month. And as far as I'm concerned, pride is not a virtue. And a month, it's like, really? A month? Really? A month? Christmas is one day.
Well, Christmas is, it could be 12. Yeah.
True,
Advent is a month.
Fair enough. Yeah, but we don't have public parades for Advent.
I get what you mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, Pride. Yeah, we're really celebrating that, are we? Because that's a cardinal sin, and it really is. And I mean really. And month, that's a little, you're pushing it, guys. So I said...
Can I ask why it's a cardinal sin? Because I'm a bit in the dark here. I didn't...
Well, you're agnostic atheist, of course.
Okay. Well, it's because, look, we're having a productive conversation. Okay, so how can we tell? Are you interested in the conversation?
Yeah.
So am I. Is the time going by quickly? Okay. Yes. Okay, so those are good markers. Now, they're biological markers. So imagine that your nervous system is tuned so that you find any experience that puts you on the edge of development as engaging. So imagine you're wrestling or you're playing or you're in a sports competition. Now, you want to be matched with someone who's about as good as you, or maybe even a little better. And you think, well, why? If it's about victory, so if it's about power, why not find some player who's nowhere near as good as you and just stomp them? And the answer is, well, that's not fair. That's one answer. And the other is, well, that's no fun. It's like, well, why is it no fun if the point is the victory? And the answer is, well, the point isn't the victory. The point is, well, what is the point? Well, the point is the fun. Yeah, but what's the point of the fun? Well, the point of the fun is to signal optimal development. And so that's the line between yin and yang. That's the line of meaning. And it's the line between chaos and order. And chaos is where you don't understand things at all. And order, in its extreme, is where you don't understand as much as you think you do, right? So it gets tyrannical. And so structure and lack of structure, or actuality and possibility. Now, how do you mediate between those two? And the answer is you have an instinct for that. And the instinct is meaning and engagement. And your nervous system is signaling to you, this conversation isn't so contentious that we're upset. And it's not so mundane that we're bored. It's right on the border. Okay, so let's go back to the tweet, the mean tweet. So I said, so why is pride a sin? Okay, so pride's a sin because humility is the precondition for play. So the reason that we can have this conversation and it's working is because you know there are some things you don't know. And I know that there are some things I don't know. And I assume that you might know some things that I don't know that are useful, and vice versa. And then we can throw our mutual knowledge back and forth in this spirit of, let's say, playful engagement, and we can move towards mutual enlightenment and redemption. And I would say redemption because, well, you're trying to redeem yourself from your ignorance and your blindness, but you're also trying to redeem yourself from your excessive pride. And your pride would be, I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm doing. It's like, what I know goes. It's like, well, maybe. It's like, is everything paradisal around you? Is everything set in perfect order around you? And if the answer to that is no, well, probably you have something to learn. And then you might say, well, what's the attitude that signals that you have something to learn? And the answer is, technically, the answer is humility. And that's the opposite of pride. And so pride is a sin because it leads you to be a tyrant and it stops you from learning. And then it also leads you to, the tyrant part is exercise control over others because you're right. And so pride is one of the cardinal sins, along with lying. Those two things together are sort of the nexus of hell. So like a totalitarian state is prideful because the totalitarians say, well, we already know everything. It's embodied in Marxist doctrine. We've got the truth. 100% of the truth. And if you dare to oppose it, you're obviously an enemy because we have 100% of the truth. And not only do we have the truth, but our interpretation of the truth is 100% correct. It's like, really?
It's quite dogmatic in this.
Well, unbelievably dogmatic. And, that can manifest itself on the religious front too, and does quite frequently. It's often why people criticize religious institutions. And all institutions can tilt into that. But pride is the opposite of humility, and humility is the precondition for learning. And, you might say, that's partly why humility is something that was practiced, say, by genuinely religious people as a virtue, because the idea would be to open yourself up like a child. You know how open a child is to learning. Well, the child doesn't assume he or she knows everything already. They're just looking around all the time, which is one of the things so remarkable about children. They're just looking around all the time at everything they don't know. And with us, like an infant, they're just like this all the time, wondering what in the world's going on and trying to learn. And so pride stops learning. And so when I see something like Pride Month, I think pride, that's not a virtue. It's not a virtue.
Can I ask? Sorry to cut you off again.
That's okay. So that's only a little tiny fraction of the tweet. By the way,
the confusion for me, I guess, is when I hear your reaction to Pride Month. I personally have never. I'm not a gay guy, and I don't really have a lot of gay friends, if I'm honest with you.
We're okay.
We look at each other occasionally a little too long.
I've noticed that. It's quite sad.
Try it. I mean, we're like work husbands for sure. But when I see all over my social media, the rainbows are everywhere, I'm kind of like, my life gets invaded by it, but it's not an inconvenience to me. I'm like, let them have it. What if it makes them happy? Like, whatever. It doesn't annoy me in any way. And when I watched your reaction there, it was kind of like, oh, I wonder why you find that maybe more irritating.
Well, it's just too much.
Right.
That's why. It's like, I agree with you. So first of all, technically speaking, any social norm has a unity at the center. That's what makes it a norm or an ideal, and has a fringe at the periphery. And the category has to be loose enough so the fringe can be allowed to exist. But the fringe can't take the center because the center has to be a unity or it's not a center. And so in our society, the fringe keeps taking the center, and that can't happen because
the unity goes with the flow too much. As a whole.
Well, it's also because the fringe feels alienated because they're not at the center.
Okay.
But it doesn't matter.
But the center is also, I guess, the center, some people would argue, had become... I don't fully believe this. But in a way, but also become quite lazy, maybe a little bit sloppy in the way that it was operating, and some people saw a bit of a void in that unity.
It always happens. That's the evil uncle. It happens all the time.
Not that LGBT people are evil uncles, but
no. But I mean, the center has an evil uncle.
Right.
The center is the center is a little off center, and it's a little more tyrannical than it should be.
And it varies.
Of course it does. And that's right. It varies from time to time because the center has to move, which is a weird thing. And the reason the center has to move is because the environment moves. And it's like a snake, and you got to keep up with it. And so that's why dialogue is necessary, because the way that we adjudicate the moving center, is through logos, is through dialogue.
So then how do you,
can I interject? Because I'm just thinking, like, when you said earlier about the evil uncle, in the way the center moves, generally speaking, you said to say people who want power, like to say that they are always tyrannical is just not true.
Oh no.
But does that not mean, though, by the very nature of wanting to get that more of the percentage is leaning towards being the evil uncle, generally speaking?
No, well, it depends on the society. It's definitely a risk. I mean, if you look around the world, most societies aren't free. Right, and you could get a rough estimate of that just by looking at, well, which societies attract immigrants, and that's just an obvious marker, right? It's like, do you want to live there or not? That's the fundamental. Or do you want to leave where you are and go there? You say, well, there isn't perfect. It's like, fair enough.
It's freer though.
It is right. It's better than where you're at, and so you can just rank countries by how many people want to go there, and you get a rough estimate of who's got the balance right. And so you might say, well, order keeps chaos under control. It's like, yes, but not optimally. What keeps chaos under control, first of all, it's not under control, it's balanced. That's a better way of thinking about it. What keeps order and chaos optimally balanced is something like logos. And I mean that technically. When you have a dialogue, so our dialogue is engaging. So dialogue means logos. It means two logos interacting. So the question is, what's logos? And logos is something like the spirit that mediates between order and chaos. And it is why is it a spirit? Well, it's a spirit because it can inhabit you, and it produces a mode of being. And the mode of being is something like lack of self-consciousness and deep engagement. And so that's the mark that things are balanced. And that's not a tyrant. It's the very opposite of a tyrant. And it's not order. It's the phenomenon that produces habitable order out of chaos. And you can tell when that's happening, because it happens if you're in a loving relationship with your wife, and there's that playful dynamic that goes along with that. It happens when you have the same with your kids. It manifests itself most clearly in the spirit of play. And so our discussion is somewhat playful, like we're pushing each other. We're trying to discuss things we don't understand, and there's a back and forth. But it's optimally balanced because there's a bit of humor about it. So that's one of the ways you can tell it's optimally balanced. And with any luck, we're doing it well enough so that other people who aren't part of the conversation still find it engaging, right? And so you can tell that we've got something right there. Not only is it working for the two of us and the two of us and the three of us, but also it's working in a manner that works for us, that's working for other people. So there's a kind of harmonious balance there that's sort of like music. And music's a good representation of that. That's why people play music, right? Because it marks the spirit of play, because musicians are playing with sound, and they do that in a harmonious way where all the parts are related to one another and are moving towards some point. And so music is a great representation of the spirit of play. It's the best representation of the spirit of play, I think, abstractly of all the arts. And so that's the antithesis to power. That's the right way of thinking about it. It's the antithesis to power, especially corrupt power. Now, back to pride. Pride is an impediment to the spirit of play. That's a good way of thinking about it. Pride requires the imposition of force, because if I know what I'm doing, and I'm trumpeting that as well as something that marks my identity above yours, I'm proud of it, then I can't engage in dialogue. I can't be humble. I can't open myself up to revelation, let's say, because a conversation is a form of revelation, right? Because it's interpersonal communication. I get access to you, which is quite something, because you've paid for your experience with hardship, and you can tell me about that, and if I listen, then maybe I won't have to have the hardship that would be necessary to garner the wisdom.
How often do you find that's the case? Because I don't know, I feel like a lot of the time maybe people have told me while I was young, avoid this or avoid that, and the only time I've really learned it is when it kind of happened to me. Well, I think the less you're willing to die optimally, the more it has to be forced upon you by fate. And so if you keep yourself updated because you're looking in the nooks and crannies, then the serpents can't breed and come out and get you. And that's also an extremely old story. Like the notion that if you ignore
a snake anywhere. It'll just grow, and eventually it'll come out of the closet and get you, you know. And so the question, well, what do you do about that? It's like, well, you go look for the snakes while they're still babies. And so, to some degree, that's what we're doing in this conversation, is we're thinking, well, this bugs me, and this bugs me, and I don't really understand this, and I don't really understand that. Maybe we should discuss it, delineate it, unpack it, and so then we can dispense with the problem before it makes itself manifest at a large scale. And that's why we have a right to free speech. So first of all, we don't have a right to free speech. That's a wrong way of thinking about it. Any society that's going to stabilize itself across time has to be predicated on the ability of people to communicate. Why? Well, because that's how we think. Because you might think you go home and think. It's like, first of all, don't be thinking you're that good at thinking. It's really hard to learn how to think. You have to learn how to divide yourself into several people internally. And then you have to let those people represent things you don't want to represent. And then you have to let them have a war in your head. And you have to be able to tolerate that. That's really hard. And you probably can't do it. There's very few people who are expert at that. It takes years of training. So how do you do it if you're not able to really think? Now, that doesn't mean you can't think at all, but don't be thinking you're an expert at it. Well, you do that by talking to people. That's how you think. And then the question is, why do you think? Well, Alfred North Whitehead said, the reason we think is so that we can let our thoughts die instead of us. So imagine you have a stupid idea, which is highly probable, right?
Just imagine.
You might have 50 of them a day.
Many.
So then you think, well, let's go act out that stupid idea, which is what you do if you're an impulsive. And so you act out the stupid idea and you get just walloped by the world and maybe you die. Well, so what's an alternative? Well, why don't you throw your stupid idea out on the table to a bunch of other people and say, well, I have this idea and I'm kind of thinking about acting it out. Is it stupid? And maybe you're prideful about your idea because, you know, you're attracted by it and you thought it up, whatever that means. And so now you're glued to it. Plus it tiles something for you. So you're invested in it. And you don't want it to be a stupid idea. But then, like, well, fine. Do you want to die? Or do you want let your idea die? And so a lot of what we do in dialogue is kill stupid ideas. And we do that so we don't act them out. And we don't want to act them out because then we die. And this even works biologically. So the part of your brain that generates thought grew out of the part of your brain that you use to voluntarily control your actions. So you could say a thought is a potential action. People think a thought is a representation of the world. It's like, yeah, not fundamentally. Fundamentally, a thought is a potential action. So then in your imagination, you make avatars of yourself. So that's you in your imagination. What if I did this? It's a little avatar of yourself. You think, what if I did this? Here's the world. I act like this. These good things happen. That's my vision. Then you throw your vision on the table and you say, well, I have this vision. And you say, well, that's a stupid vision because you didn't take this into account. And how are you going to do that? And you think, oh, that sucks because I had this vision. But, well, thank you, because I didn't see those snakes, you know?
Right.
And then it's tricky because maybe you're mad because I had a vision and you don't have one, and so you're pissed off about that, and so you're just attacking my vision because you know you don't have anything better to do. And
I've had this conversation with someone before where a kid told me he wanted like 1 million followers on social media, and I was like, yeah, but that's not going to happen though. Like, not for you. Right. Because I had the experience, you know, and then I had that moment where they basically freaked out right in front of me.
You shatter a dream.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so a dream is a tile of the future. So you say, what's the future? Well, you don't know. Well, here's a vision. So it's a tile. And then it covers the future. And it also covers it in a pleasing way. And then you come along and say, you know, it's a little low res. Well, you could say to someone who wants that, are you sure you want 1 million followers? You know, because people say, I'd be happy if I had $400 million. It's like, you think you could handle that responsibility, do you? Like, you're so sure of that all of a sudden you'd have all this money dumped on you can't even control your household budget. You live from paycheck to paycheck. Now somebody's going to dump a treasure on your steps and that's going to fix your life. It's like, okay, how much are you going to give to your relatives? Like, none? Oh, that'll work out real well. Too much? So then you're going to take away their responsibility from them, are you? And you're going to get that balance exactly right. And then what are you going to do with that money? Because as soon as you got the the parasites are going to come in and take your money.
Yeah.
Like I had clients that were...
Happens quickly, believe me.
Unbelievably quickly. It happens unbelievably quickly.
Yeah.
You know, you'll see, well, the average family fortune lasts 3 generations.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. Because money sitting around, not being carefully monitored, it's like water. It just disappears.
It's happened to me in my life. It's the amount of money I've had in my life.
You've spent 3 family generations worth of cash.
No, I'm talking about just it's been quite something because I came from nothing.
Yeah.
And I've made amounts of money that I never dreamed were possible.
Right.
And yet I have very little to show for it, if I'm being honest with you, because
Right.
of what culminates around you and how many people all of a sudden come to the table. And me being a generous, soft-natured person, they say a fool is easily parted with his money. I feel
Yep.
like a fool, to
Yep.
be honest with you. One thing I do want to actually go back to, because there's certain things about you that have always spoken to me specifically. We were talking about Lion King earlier. And
We also haven't finished uncovering that tweet.
I do.
No, absolutely, yeah.
But this is important, actually, for me personally to bring up, because Lion King, Forrest Gump, Godfather, Braveheart, all my favourite movies surround about young boy becomes a man.
Right. Well, that's the Pinocchio story.
Yeah,
and the Peter Pan story, except
Another
he
one.
doesn't manage it.
Your
There's
2
so many
lectures
of
were
them.
great on those.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's so many of them, and me personally, my relationship with my dad was difficult growing up. He was in prison. All sorts of things happened where I wasn't with him a lot.
Yeah.
And when I hear you talk about young men's search to become a man, and it feels like obviously you've got a huge audience around those topics when you've covered them, because so many men, young men especially, feel so lost right now, and they're searching for these answers of how do we get to that point. And I mean, it feels like when I look back in even 50 years ago, that wasn't there the way it is now.
Oh, that's definitely the case.
Yeah.
Well, when my dad was a school teacher. He's still alive. And he got disenchanted with school teaching in part because all of the authority in his classroom was taken from him. So if there were disciplinary issues in the class, it had to be brought up the hierarchy to the administrative echelons above him. And so he could feel his authority in the class slipping away. And he was quite an authoritative teacher. My dad was my teacher in grade 6. For math. I wasn't in his homeroom, but I remember, and by grade 6, this is about 12 years old, kids are pretty pushy and fractious, you know, and 10 minutes before the class started, the first time my dad walked into the room, everyone was silent because he had a reputation, and the reputation was don't mess with him. And it wasn't because he was mean. You know, he had a hard spine, and you didn't want to push him, but he was authoritative. And he also got disenchanted with television. So when he was young, and even when I was young, there were shows like My 3 Sons and Father Knows Best. Can you imagine a show called Father Knows Best now? The closest I've seen to that recently is Ted Lasso. That's the only sitcom I've seen for like 5 decades in some sense that has a genuinely positive male lead. So kudos to Ted Lasso. You see that a little bit in The Simpsons, hey? Because that's why it was such an interestingly subversive show, because Homer's a bumbling fool. And Marge, in some sense, has the moral upper hand, but not entirely. But Homer, the thing about Homer is he's trying. He's not very bright, but he is trying. And he would like to be a good father, and he's faithful to his wife and his kids. And so there is this underlying solidity of that male character, but, you know, it's damning with faint praise. And now young men, they're under assault from two directions, fundamentally. One is all male authority is nothing but patriarchal oppression. And so imagine now you're an ambitious young man, which is the drive toward that authority. Well, all that is a manifestation of the power dynamic in men that produced the patriarchal, oppressive, colonial tyranny. And so now you're a moral young man. You think, well, my ambition is to be not only to be questioned, it's to be squelched entirely because it's nothing but a manifestation of power. Imagine that maybe you escape from that by some maneuvering, but then there's another assault that's waiting, which is all human activity is nothing but part of the force that's devouring the planet and that's going to put us all in flames. It's like, oh good, so not only am I part of the patriarchal oppressive force, but I'm also the despoiler of Mother Nature. And so if you tell boys that constantly, and you do, and then you also say all of the sexual advances that you make towards women on any front whatsoever are to be regarded with extreme skepticism. And then you feed them pornography on a non-stop basis. So there's an easy way out. And that's an unbelievably powerful...
Oh, it's a drug.
Oh, well, no one really thinks this through in some sense. But any 12-year-old boy, 13-year-old boy can now see more beautiful naked women in 15 minutes than the richest king in history ever saw in his whole life. You think, well, we don't have to worry about that. It's like, yeah, you have to worry about that. That's a huge problem. And it's a demoralizing problem because it offers an easy way out. And so if all of your ambition is nothing but the junior manifestation of power and should be squelched out of you as early as possible, and schools do this because they punish boys for playing. So hyperactivity looks like suppressed play behavior. So there's good animal models of that, by the way. And you can, if you deprive animals of play, especially juvenile male animals, a lot of this has been done with rats because they're very playful, by the way. If you deprive them of play, they'll play hyperactively when you give them the opportunity. And you can suppress that with methylphenidate. That's Ritalin. It suppresses play behavior. Now it focuses attention deficit. It's like, no, probably not. These boys just need to be out in the playground, running around playing like for more time than they're allowed with their boisterous competitive play behavior, and we don't need competition. All games should be cooperative, which is complete rubbish. It's not a game if it's just cooperative, and it's such a dopey view of cooperation. Like if you and I are playing one-on-one basketball, then, well, are we cooperating or competing? Well, did you bring a chessboard? No. You came to play basketball. Well, how about that's cooperation? We've decided what the rules are going to be. That's cooperation. Obviously, fundamental. We're playing the same game. That's cooperation. Think it through. And so then, are we competing? Well, yes, but what does that mean? It means, well, we're getting in each other's way in some sense while we're trying to hit the goal. But we're doing that in a way that improves our skill at hitting the goal. Because if you set up an obstacle to me, which is what you do if we're playing one-on-one basketball, you're making it difficult for me to hit the target. And so that means you're making me better at hitting the target. And if we do that optimally, then it's fun. And you might say, why? Well, the word sin is derived from a Greek word, hamartia, and there's a Jewish parallel semantic track, by the way, that has the same underlying structure. Hamartia is an archery term. It means to miss the target. And so what we're trying to do is hit the target. Well, what's the target? Well, that's the question. It's a hard question. But we're trying to hit the target. And how do you know? Well, what are people doing when they're playing sports? Like all sports virtually circulate around hitting the target. It might be crossing the finish line first, so the target would be being the fastest among that group. So that would be swimming, let's say. Or it might be football, all of its variants. Obviously, you're hitting the target. That's what basketball is. That's what shooting is. That's what archery is. It's all hitting the target. Now, we're hunting creatures. We're based on a hunting platform. And we're visual hunters, too. And so we're looking at targets all the time and trying to hit them. And part of what we're doing when we're competing is we set a joint target. And then we set up an adversarial structure that improves our skill while we practice hitting the target. And so is that competition? It's like, well, no. It's not competition in that the goal is to defeat you, even though I'm going to try to win because otherwise the game's no fun. The real game is, can we make each other better in a sustainable way so that we can hit the target more effectively? And men, especially on the sports pitch, of course women do this too, but it's more of a masculine enterprise in some sense. It's a masculine enterprise, not a male enterprise, not for men only. It's honing your ability to hit the target. And when you deviate from the target, deviation from the target, that's sin. That's what it means. It's so useful to know that. It's like, well, I missed the mark, and then you're guilty about it. Well, you should be. You're supposed to hit the mark. And what's the mark? Well, the mark is the line between order and chaos. Or the mark is the playful engagement in good conversation. The mark is a really intense game. An intense game is you're serious about it. The person is pushing you right to your bloody limit, and vice versa. And you want that in a conversation too, and maybe you want that in a movie. You know, you want to be pushed to your limit. That's why people go to horror movies, for example. Not past your limit, because that's stressful, but right on that edge. Comedy does that. Mm-hmm. Like a great comedian puts you right, can I say this? Jimmy Carr's good at that. So is Bill Burr. It's like, oh my God, do I have to say this? Mm-hmm. Yes. Here it is. Everybody goes, how? It's so funny because the laughter is spontaneous. And it's an indication that the person hit the target. Mm-hmm. And you can't regulate it because you don't laugh consciously. Exactly. Right? You laugh unconsciously. And then the comedian knows, hey, I hit the target with that one. Everybody goes, oh, I can't believe you said that. Mm-hmm. Someone had to say it. Thank God they said it. Mm-hmm. And then we get enlightened a little bit by the comedians. And so they hit the target. And they're really good at that. So Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, said, the fool is the precursor to the savior. Why? Because the fool will tell the truth, right? And you can't redeem yourself without telling the truth. And in the court, so the court might be the place where the evil king rules. And that's one possibility, the king's court. Maybe the evil king is ruling. Well, you need a fool. Why? Well, the fool's beneath contempt. So the fool can say anything. Well, so is the fool or the king? Because if the fool is the only person free enough to say anything, it's not obvious that the king is in control. It might be the fool's in control that has the real power.
But he doesn't have the responsibility that goes with that.
Well, he has the responsibility to be funny.
Right. Okay.
Right. Well, so that is a responsibility. Yeah. It's a responsibility to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. Now, he's not the administrator, right? But at least he's the person who's feeding truth into the culture. And certainly comedians do that. Like one marker of someone you can't trust is, well, I have no sense of humor. I don't see why that's funny. It's like, yeah, you don't. That's pretty sad. There's some things comedians shouldn't be allowed to make fun of. It's like, yeah, you're going to decide that, are you? You're going to decide what people get to think is funny, this unconscious manifestation. Mm-hmm. You're going to regulate that. And you're going to claim pridefully that, well, yeah, I'm going to regulate that and things will be a hell of a lot better because of it. It's like, yeah, if you're the sort of tyrant that can't stand, if you're the sort of king that can't stand the fool, then you're a tyrant. Mm-hmm. So that's a great marker for people to be leery of.
One thing I was interested to know is I've never heard you talk about conspiracy theories, and I wonder if any of them had ever appealed to you where you were thinking, actually,
I'm not particularly conspiratorial by temperament.
But you're investigative, so yes, I just wondered if there was anything about...
Well, conspiracy theories, in some sense, are the fantasies of disagreeable people. So disagreeable people are very skeptical, and they think, what's going on behind the scenes? And so and then some of them get a little on the psychotic end, and so they have quite a wide fantasy network, so they get paranoid. So when disagreeable people become psychotic, they get paranoid. And so then you might say, well, what do they say? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that no one is after you, which I really love. And the thing about paranoid people is, well, sometimes they're right. So they produce a lot of behind the scenes theories. And 2% of the time they're on target. And so it's kind of useful to keep an eye on the conspiracy theories because they're the most skeptical people who are using the most fantasy. Now, and so they're creative in a sense. They're creative in this sort of disagreeable way. Mm. The thing about creativity... I feel like
you're describing Alex Jones, basically. Here.
In a way. There's lots of people like that, and they're worth attending to because now and then they dig up a nugget, Right. Yeah. And so, but a lot of it's noise and not signal. Mm-hmm. And this is actually the problem with creativity, is that creativity is absolutely necessary. But most ideas are stupid and destructive. So, what do we do with that? Mm-hmm. Because zero creativity means you can't adapt. Nothing changes. But everything changes, so you better change with it. Mm-hmm. But how fast? And the answer is, well, the creative person thinks, well, change this and change this and change this and radically transform that. And here's a good idea. It's like, maybe sometimes one of those ideas would work incrementally better. But probably not. Probably they just upset everything. So you got to be unbelievably judicious in relationship to creative ideas. And the same thing works on the paranoid front. It's like, and you need rules about that. So one rule is, don't assume malevolence when stupidity is sufficient explanation.
Boris Johnson.
And that it's a really good rule because stupidity, ignorance, let's say, mm-hmm. and I don't even mean willful blindness. I mean just the fact that people don't know what the hell they're doing. That accounts for so many problems. that you can hardly even believe it. And then you could add willful blindness to that, which is people's refusal to look at something they know they should look at, but don't. And then you can add some malevolence in there. And all of those are a factor, but one of the ways to protect yourself against conspiratorial thinking is to give some due credence to ignorance. Like, people make lots of mistakes because they just don't know any better. And then they make some mistakes because they won't look. And then they make some mistakes because they're trying to cause trouble. The conspiratorial thinker jumps right to malevolence and willful blindness. It says, well, you know, you're willfully blind and you're malevolent. It's like, well, yes, a bit. Yes, but not completely. And mostly I'm just stupid. You know, if I get in an argument with my wife, and this happens, we have a relatively fractious relationship, you know, although fundamentally it's peaceful because we sort things out. But she'll sometimes, well, me too, with her, I'll think, what, she's trying to hurt my feelings. Maybe that's a way of thinking about it. It's like, or I'm trying to hurt her feelings, or I'm not paying attention properly. It's like, no, I'm just too stupid to know what you want. And we've really sort of figured this out.
Do you know what's really strange? One of my first questions was going to be something about, like, why the fuck are women such hard bloody work?
Yeah, well, they're hard work. I can tell you why to some degree.
Tell me, because I don't know what the fuck they want at this point.
Women on average experience more negative emotion than men. So really? 75% of divorces are initiated by women, and women are more unhappy than men. And so they're more prone to depression, and they're more prone to anxiety disorders. They're more prone to suicide attempts, although men commit suicide more often because they use guns, because men tend to be more violent even towards themselves.
Men are very decisive, aren't they?
Yeah. Yes.
But in nature, once their mind's made up.
Yes. So women are higher negative emotion. And so why? Well, it kicks in at puberty. And so why would women become more sensitive to threat at puberty? Well, let's figure it out. It's pretty straightforward. They're at a physical disadvantage. Because boys and girls can wrestle and fight, but men and women can't. So men are way stronger, especially in the upper body. And so women hit men more than the reverse by a lot.
Yeah.
So you might say, well, are women or men more violent? Well, if it's just blows struck, women win. But if it's blows that land, right,
that leave damage,
right, exactly. Yeah. And the women know that, so they know they can give you a cuff, and it's like, well, whatever. Wait, there's two more things. Okay, so women get comparatively weaker physically, so the world's more dangerous. Okay, then they're more vulnerable sexually. Right? Then they have to take care of infants. So they're tilted towards more threat detection. And so that makes them maybe suboptimally happy when you think about them as individuals.
Because they're always aware of all of these threats. So it's harder for them to switch off. Whereas when I walk down the street, I'm not worried in the same way. Yeah.
Of course.
This has been really something, and I would love to have you back on next time you're in London. Truly an individual in the world, and someone who's bringing interesting things. So, how would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as alive.
Yeah?
Yeah. People have asked me that before. I mean, I'd like to be remembered, I suppose, as someone who was encouraging, because that's what I think primarily I'm doing, is encouraging people. It's like, yeah, you're full of problems and you're massive snakes and all that, but not fundamentally. You're the thing that can handle snakes fundamentally. So if you would be willing to. And I not only do I believe that in some sense, I know it's true. I know it's true. So I'm trying to tell people that. It's like, yeah, you're a sad case, but there's a hell of a lot more to you than you think. Like, way more. Enough to cope with the trouble of the world inside you. There is enough to cope with the trouble of the world. And if you had enough courage, you could let that out. Enough courage and faith, you could let that out, and everything would be better because of it. Really, really. And so that's a good story, and it's also true. And so I'm trying to tell that story. So
keep shining your light on the snakes. I do like that. That was Jordan Peterson on the True Geordie podcast. Obviously, they can go and find out where you're going to be. Or is there a website that you prefer?
Yeah, well, they can go to jordanbpeterson.com, and my tour is scheduled there. List of recommended books. So if you want to enlighten yourself on the intellectual side, I have 100 books there. If you spent 3 years reading them, you'd be a much sharper knife in the drawer, let's say.
Okay.
And so people are welcome to do that. I have a couple of online programs at selfauthoring.com and understandmyself.com. And the latter is a personality test that'll outline your strengths and weaknesses very accurately. And if you do that with your partner, you get a report that tells you where you're compatible and where you're not and why.
Or your business partner, maybe.
Or your business partner,
right.
absolutely.
We should do that.
We're going to modify the site so that fathers and sons can do it, and mothers and daughters and business partners.
You should make a dating app, because
we've thought about that
honestly,
too.
They're not very good. So you just get yourself on there.
Well, it'd be nice to be reasonably matched temperamentally with your potential partner. Right?
Just be a series of dates of guys talking to women about what Carl Jung said, though, surely, if they're just your fans.
Okay. So. That was Jordan Peterson on True Geordie Podcast. Big thank you. I appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next one.
Nice to meet you guys. Thanks for the invitation. And thanks to all you who are listening and watching as well. Yeah, much appreciated.